Good morning. A very warm welcome. I'm very happy we are going to get 20. It's amazing. We are going to have a celebration day today. It's on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of our master's program here at the Angewandte. My name is Beatrice Jaschke and I'm part of the ECM team, and I will lead you a little bit through the day. What we are talking about, thinking about for many, many years is really these big questions. So how can the critique of the museum have consequences in a museum? So this was the starting point, and we said we will celebrate this day with a conference where we all try to think together, figure out if there can be changed something, and we invited guests where we think that they already changed some things in their institutions, in the way they are working and doing things. So we would like to learn from you. We are really happy to have you as our guests. And so the idea of the day is that in the morning we are going to have sessions. We will have panel discussions here to get some insights. And then we also have time, and I think this is a special thing, that we can work out deeper in smaller groups, concentrate, and then we will have a kind of assembly here all together and see what comes out. And we also have today some artists with us, some graphic recording. You will see Aldo Gianotti somewhere with a Pat making some sketches. We also have Carlos Toledo, who will have some taping outside. We will have a video guest book by Marion Oberhofer you will find in the end of the room. So during the day we will ask you maybe to give us some notes, some comments on what you think, and then in the evening we will have a party, we will celebrate and have some music and buffet. So that's, let's say, the program of today. And now I'm also very thankful to announce that Gerald Bast, our dean, was the one who not only invited the ECM to the Angewandte 20 years ago under the direction of Renate Göbel, who is also here today, and I'm really happy that you are here. He also supported us in our activities for the many years now, enabled us also to make many books, exhibitions, and also enabled this conference. So thank you, Gerald Bast, and I give over.
Good morning, everyone. It is a wonderful day. Celebrating 20 years of a very important program at this university is a reason to say thank you. Thank you to those who made these 20 years happen. Renate Göbel was mentioned, thank you. And then thank you all the participants and members of Schnittpunkt who made these many last years happen in a way which is quite remarkable. To talk about exhibitions, to make exhibitions in praxis and theory a topic of not only academic but partly also societal discourse is important. And I say this very consciously in times when we are facing that the world seems to fall apart in different areas, from war to pandemics, from the questioning of the way continuing democracy to, not the least, the climate crisis. So there often is a question, can we in these environments even talk about institutions like museums? Are we allowed to talk about how can we make proper exhibitions? And if we accept that we are living and want to live in the future in a society of civilization which deserves this name, we have to do this. And we not only have to ask about the future and have to talk about the future and look for the future of new ways of exhibiting, of new ways of institutional change, but we also have to ask which future? Where should we go? What is the meaning of an exhibition? What is the meaning of the institution museum? This is necessary also in other contexts. We all the time at this university ask about the meaning and the purpose of the arts. We ask about the meaning and the purpose and the aim of a university. And this is necessary because if we want to have a future of civilization, we have to negotiate these questions. Which future? Where do we want to go with these elementary institutions of the human civilization? And so I thank you, the proponents of these last 20 years. I thank the graduates, the many graduates from this master program. And I thank all the partners in Austria and abroad who participated in the last 20 years in this program and who now came to participate in this discussion about the future of exhibiting in theory and praxis and the future of museums. Not only any future, but in the meaning of which future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, which future is a good and important question. And now I would like to introduce to our dear colleague Nora Sternfeld. Nora Sternfeld, she is educator and curator. She's since 2020 now, she's also professor in Hamburg at the Art University. Before, she has been documenter professor in Kassel. Before that, also in Helsinki, curating, mediating art. And well, besides that, there are so many things, like she's founding member of Bureau Trafocas. She is also part of Free Thought, a platform also of research, educational productions and thinkers. She's traveling a lot in many places. She moves a lot, I would say. She publishes a lot and sings a lot. And whenever the ECM is calling, she's here. So at least once a month she's coming, she's teaching. Also, especially when we have questions like also very critical political questions, politics, history, anti-racism. There are so many things. And today now you give us a short introduction of the topic. And thank you, Nora. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you. It's kind of moving to be here. 20 years of doing this together, being here with many teachers, with our teachers and our students. The question, so we are doing this since 20 years, and in somehow it's a gift for us to share this question that is an open question about the relation between critical theory and critical practice. And this question has been with us since we are doing this, but it has changed. And it is a question that is as important as it is complicated and contradictory. What has changed is that actually for a long time it seemed that these political questions, they have been asked many times by many people, by activists, by theorists. They were not at the center of the institutions. And it seems now as if it is totally obvious that we have a dean that believed in us from the beginning, but that we have someone opening such a conference with highly political words. Now for us, what does it mean? I thought when we ask the question, how can critical theory become critical practice, it might make sense to just look a bit back and remind us the critique of the museum. And remind us that in the second half of the 20th century, critique of the museum was not in the center of the museums. It was in the contrary. I mean, if you think about the history of Documenta, for example, modern art was very able to imagine itself radical per se, just because it is modern. And now we know that many people who organized the first Documenta, especially Werner Haftmann, but also 9 others, have been part of the NSDAP. And not only they were Nazis by party, Haftmann was also killing partisans and torturing them. So we know that this history of modernism is not in itself innocent. So for a very long time, it looked like exhibitions and museums, just because they are there, just because they are white, there is no doubt that they are good and that they make sense. For a very long time, we know that they were based, this was the idea of the modern museum since the 19th century, of creating identity and alterity, our own discourse and the others, that they upheld national boundaries, that they displayed valuable objects and objective values. And despite this, especially in the museums, these issues were not mentioned at all. So for a very long time it happened and it was not visible, it was kind of hidden. And the Modern Art Museum was actually, with its own distinctive way of showing, a very classical institution that would use these seemingly neutral white cubes to create a discourse in which the museum and its curators took on the role of neutralizing figures. Of course, this is not true for every practice, and in the 70s there were very, very interesting practices actually that have been done in museums. We just talked about the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, where in the 70s a whole department of research and of transformation has been built whose idea was to challenge society. But then it seemed some kind of forgotten for quite some time. And then, around 20 years ago, these self-evident premises on which the museum was based were indeed called into question. So the critique became louder and louder. So what was this critique? It was a critique, as I said, on the neutrality and objectivity of the museum, of its distinctions, of its powerful modes of display, of the national bourgeois, Western and patriarchal gestures of demonstration, of the entanglement of a powerful production of meaning within racist structures. And it was in this time that we could see that this timeless claim to truth and the universal validity of museal knowledge breaks down. It doesn't seem so obvious anymore. Artists have addressed the museum, questioned it, and enacted what is then called institutional critique. They addressed the male gaze, the racist exclusivity, the racist exclusions, the epistemic violence, the neo-colonial gestures, and they called the museum a mausoleum. It's also interesting that there was a time when the museum seemed kind of dead. It seemed like a mausoleum. It seemed like everything is petrified. This is not the case anymore, so it looks like, to a certain extent, these voices were heard from hegemony because the museum had to change for another reason. So although the critique of the museum of its exclusions, its normative narrative, and its exploitative logics became more and more explicit, both on the street and the art, as well as the reflexive field of museum studies, this nonetheless hardly seemed to have found its way into the major mega museums up to the turn of the millennium. And then it starts. I mean, if you look at the history of activism towards the museum, it's much older than that, but it only changes in the beginning of the 21st century, when suddenly a rumbling could be heard in the depth of the old-time institutions, and funding organizations and relevant museums began to seek to open up the canon. And now we could say, wow, great, social struggles are making their mark, but is it really the case? Together with Belinda Kasim-Kaminsky and Natalie Bayer in our book, Curating as Anti-Racist Practice in the ECM series, we discuss that while critical debates may be taking place today, and there may be a talk of decolonial and post-migrant museum approaches, they often replicate exoticizing hierarchical and binary narrative patterns. And this is now I think, one of the reasons why hegemony takes in a transformistic way the critique. We all know that it has been in the same 20 to 30 years in which critical theory in museums has been formulated, that economic criteria and considerations have become increasingly important throughout the exhibition field. So it's of course, like in history, it's also inscribed in the name of ECM. You have this management in the name of ECM. So 20 years ago, when ECM was founded, it was clear that such a program would function when it has management in its title. 10 years earlier, this would not be a title for a program. It would have been another title. And managers, this is what was important to build 20 years ago. Managers is like the name of the stylish functionary of the neoliberal museum. And these economic criteria and considerations have an impact on organizational forms, production conditions, and decision-making processes. Museums, exhibition institutions, and art academies have been increasingly directed towards competitive market orientation with different strategies and grouped into ever larger clusters with reference to efficiency, synergy, and professionalization in a business sense. So the condition of possibility of our critical discourse is the professionalization of a field and the economization of education. And we are sitting in the middle of that. Today, economists define more than ever how institutions act, what they collect and show, how they present themselves, and how we imagine them. So what does it mean for a curatorial program to teach curatorial theory and practice under these conditions? Would it mean to read critical theory and at the same time accept a widespread and increasing uncritical practice? And how shall we navigate in these contradictions? Can we accept them? In a lecture performance at the 2013 Istanbul Biennial, Hito Steyerl asked, is the museum a battlefield? And everyone who since 2013 has been in the ECM knows this very well. And in this context, Hito Steyerl understands the museum as a battlefield in multiple senses. On the one hand, since the French Revolution, it has been a site of anti-hegemonic struggles and a place for expressing discontent. On the other hand, it is itself, obviously, primarily a subsidiary site of dominant hegemonies, and, as Steyerl shows, it is also deeply entangled in the economies of a military-industrial complex, which, of course, becomes pretty prevalent when we are in times of war, as has been said. Nonetheless, the many radical expressions of dissatisfaction and struggles for representation are not simply to be dismissed because they provide its basis, a post-representative perspective, which, of course, is what came out of all this criticism of the exclusions of the institution, should neither abandon nor delegitimate them. So the fact that we realize that we sit in the middle of this problematic, of course, cannot just give us a good vocabulary to kind of not relate anymore to this history of struggle. So I think quite the opposite is the case. And if we talk about the crisis of the museum since the 70s and the latest since the 90s, this can only be understood as a result of these struggles. They have taken up the fight against the powerful knowledge of institutions from a bourgeois, the French Revolution, proletarian, like in the Soviet Union and later, a feminist, anti-racist, and anti-colonialist perspective. And when they could no longer be silenced, the institutions either appropriated them in order to institutionalize themselves, again here from the French Revolution to today, you can see it, or they were institutionally integrated by the powerful discourses, I guess like us. Thus, the function of the museum lies both in the preservation of the dominant hegemony and in its questioning and challenging. If we now wish to set out on the basis of a socially relevant museum after the crisis of representation, we need to decide which side we want to tend towards. So it does not mean that there is a side that is in which we would not have dirty hands. There is no side without dirty hands. This is why we go from theory to practice. I mean, we have to think about what is to be done, but also to see that without a decision on which side we are on, this won't work. Drawing on the hegemonic theory of Chantal Mouffe, I would like to advocate a radically democratic museum. According to the agonistic approach, writes Mouffe, this is about a practice that foments dissensus. But what could such a radical museology, which understands itself in terms of public and intellectual activity, look like? First of all, it would have to formulate itself in solidarity with existing social struggles. Accordingly, involved curating and educating pursues extra-institutional activist logics as well as the, let's say, political potential of the museum itself, because it's inscribed in the history of the museum, these politics, as we can see with Hito Steyr. And in this sense, it activates an explosive power of the museum with regard to itself. It questions the powerful functions of the museum on the basis of its own emancipatory functions. And what are they? From the reevaluation of values to the public assembly to critical education. It appropriates the museum as a museum and using its own means to the extent to which it is applied to both the museum in its potential for change and the social struggles that defy logics of domination. It is simultaneously entirely part of the museum and part of a different order that is perhaps first emerging. So, as you can imagine, we don't think that we can accept to teach critical theory while at the same time we have to propagate uncritical practice. We rather try to face the contradictions in the field to make them work against each other. Nobody can do this alone, and we have to work and think together to imagine different institutions in another possible world. And today is therefore a big day for us. We are happy to have the chance to think together with people who have devoted themselves to such a critical practice, some of you many years ago. And so this is the beginning. It's contradictory, it's complicated, and it's the beginning of the day. So let me hand over to my colleague Beatrice Jaschke, who will introduce the first panel.
Thank you very much, Nora. I have the honor now to introduce the first panel, and you might have seen that in the program we did a rearrangement because unfortunately Durcu Urs could not come because of health reasons. So we are having two panels today, and and then of course Corona also came along, and as I said before, we are a team of 7 directors of the ECM now. And one of us, Monica, is positive, so unfortunately she's not here with us today. But I'm glad that Martina Grisa-Stamschek, she jumped in. And so I can introduce you now to Martina. Martina, she studied conservation and restoration here at the University of Applied Arts. She worked here for more than 10 years as a research associate. Then she moved to the Technical Museum. There she was head of collections for many years, and now since last year she is head of research also at the Technical Museum. She also publishes a lot. I would love to recommend you one book that is very important, the Beau Dépôt. So it's about museums, depots, about the history and the present of depots. And in ECM, of course, she also teaches all these questions and also practical, curatorial, cultural questions. And Martina will introduce now the great guests of your panel, Lynn Balberdijk-Helborg and Charles Esche. So please.
This is our first panel, and in our morning sessions with the panels, we really wanted to make sure that everybody can get an insight into the position of every workshop leader in the afternoon. Lynn Balberdijk-Helborg is a curator and researcher at Savi Contemporary in Berlin, part of the participatory archive project Colonial Neighbors. I'm very curious to hear more about it. Lynn received her MA in post-colonial cultures and global policy at the Goldsmiths in London and moved to Berlin in 2013. In her work with the permanent collection of Savi Contemporary, she's looking for colonial traces and which are manifested in our present, and especially in the German present, I think. The collaborative archive dedicates itself to discuss silenced histories and the decanonization of the Western gaze through objects and the stories behind objects, which I think is also part of your workshop in the afternoon. Lately, Lynn curated the project Monumental Shadows, Rethinking Heritage, also a participatory project in public space about colonial figures.
Thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you also to Beatrice, Nora, and all the other participants, visitors, students, and all the people who are involved in making this beautiful program. And I also want to say I think it's absolutely beautiful and generous that for the 20 years of celebration you open a space for critical engagement and don't only celebrate your beautiful program. So a word of acknowledgement and appreciation. So as you have already mentioned, I work in a collective art space initiative that's called Savi Contemporary. And luckily, I don't work in a museum, meaning that I'm not bound to certain structures in my work. And I mean, it comes with its own downfalls. But in the afternoon workshop, I will start with thinking about the body and our perception because of ourselves and how we relate to our own body, because I want to shift from how we are centering ourselves and how we're engaging with our feelings and our being in the world. Because, you know, we're so disconnected from primordial needs, like from rest and from the urge of, I don't know, like nutrition or connectivity. How can we even think to start engaging with such big words of critical engagement and undoing the frame of museums if we can't even relate to different bodies that we need to bring into the museum? So we will start from focusing on the self and listening, the act of active listening, so to say. I want to also bring on the table that this whole debate of addressing deficits of the museum is a long debate. So we're not starting with it. I mean, this happened already like 10, 15 years ago. And I want to point out that there was an article by our still artistic director, Bonaventure Sobeng-Dikung, in Muse magazine in 2017, so 5 years ago, where he writes in the essay, The Globalized Museum, Decanonization as a Method of Reflection and Free Acts, about how are like the overall attempts of undoing the museum or making it more diverse or decanonize the program. And so he also invites to think about what political or cultural agendas are guiding initiatives or museums? Secondly, do the museums hold genuine interest in diversifying their collections and programs, as well as questioning the canonical artworks and discourses that prevail within their institutions? Or is the fact of guaranteed funding the bigger bait that enables participation but does not result in substantial engagement in pursuing this interest in diversification post-funding? Third, how can one explain that very few museums or institutions think of the intersectionality of race, gender, class, geography, and sexuality when it comes to diversifying the programs and collections, but rather focus on one of the aforementioned before proceeding to another? And last but not least, so if initiatives of diversification of museum collections and programs are to be taken seriously, institutions have to go the extra mile to implement the 3 Ps. The diversification must be reflected on the projects, the publics, and the personnel. So I also want to bring back a project that we did in collaboration with Beaux-Arts and Kulturen in Bewegung here in Germany, in Vienna, sorry. The project was called Disothering as a Method, and Disothering Beyond Afropolitan and Other Labels. So again, the 3 institutions were Beaux-Arts in Brussels, Kulturen in Bewegung in Vienna, and Savi Contemporary in Berlin. And it was about this idea of the necessity of deconstructing the notion of othering. So this cloud that lingers over institutions in Euro-America. So it consisted of an exhibition, symposia, a festival, talks and performances, a residency program, mapping research, a website. And these formats share the bringing together of artists, communities, thinkers, and people of all walks of life to reflect on contemporary processes and technologies of disothering. And part of this program was also were quantitative and qualitative questionnaires, where we thought about the biggest institutions in these 3 countries that receive public funding. So we wanted to see how is tax money that is composed of the funds of the many, how is it being used in public institutions? And who are the people who are the key roles, like how diverse are institutions when it comes to the directors, curators, etc. Because it's the same institutions that also apply for funds when it comes to subjects as diversity, decanonizing, decolonizing, etc. So, yeah, thinking about the different bodies that are representing these institutions and the various urgencies that are lying in these bodies, I want to think about the shift from this overall umbrella, from thinking of critical production of like philosophy, critical thinking, and as beautifully in your title it says, how can this critical theory become critical practice actually? And I want to think about individual, the realm of the individual, and also the realm of the collective, and do a step-by-step, like collective guiding workshop in the afternoon. So it's also in a way to think about forms, how the collective also shepherds each one of us in this endeavor towards thinking and then moving towards practicing, and challenge these paradigms that are standing like a rock that hold different bodies also immobile in this attempt, yeah. Sorry, I feel weird about this monologue, and please feel free to also ask questions or interrupt. And as I mentioned in the beginning, luckily I don't work in a museum, meaning that within this archival attempt of bringing a collection that hold objects that are connected to the colonial past of Germany's history, we don't have to follow these patterns of conservative archive making. So we challenge the questions of who is putting what on display, who can access the archive, what is out there, like what is the overall narrative. How is this collective embedded? Because if you think about objects that are connected to the colonial past, they are violent, and it's very difficult to work with objects that are uncanny, that are violent, without reproducing this perpetuate inherent violence. So again, we don't have to put things in a vitrine to make it inaccessible to this momentum of engagement, or also activating the archive. So we say it's very important to be able to feel things, to have this momentum of haptic, that I feel I'm connected to it. So you also feel the necessity of holding yourself accountable for this object. So basically what we do is also we walk away from this idea of the object is the grand evil or the importance, and the archive is the holy space of critical work, so to say. We say the objects per se are not important, but it's more about the stories and how we relate to the objects in order to draft a very fragmented collective memory map, so to say. Yeah, I mean, there's much more to say about that, but I don't want to take too much of your time. Yeah.
Yeah, I come to Charles Esche. So you are unluckily, you're luckily not working in a museum. Charles is luckily working in a museum. Most of you or us know Charles already because he's also teaching in the ECM. And we have been visiting also you at your museum. So Charles Esche is the director of the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, more than 15 years already, which is, of course, an international, really relevant reference for all who work in the field. And Charles is also professor of contemporary art and curating at Central St. Martin's in University of the Arts in London, where he works with exhibition studies. He's visiting professor at Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht and chair of CASCO in Utrecht, which we also have been visiting with the ECM. Yeah, and you are currently writing a book on demodern thinking. I think you will explain that further, what you mean by that, with Professor Waldo Mignolo, and preparing an exhibition project in the Netherlands, in Indonesia, and Australia, professionally called The Four Soils.
Thank you.
Yeah, please, Charles.
Thanks a lot. And thanks to everybody for inviting me. I suppose in this situation I also want to spend a moment just to remember everybody who's forced to flee at the moment from Ukraine, obviously is in our minds, but from Afghanistan, from Myanmar, from Yemen, from all over in the world, because we are in a moment of particular crisis in terms of forced migration at the moment, and I think it's important that we mention these things while we're here, because otherwise we forget the background to where we are. Not that it helps, but it at least feels as though we should recognize this condition outside of the walls. I'm going to try and do this in 10 minutes, so it'll be very much a bird's eye view of and an attempt really to do what I hope we can do in the workshop itself. My starting point, in a way, is picks up from what Nora was saying, and I think also about stories and the relationship between objects, because the sort of foundational document of that conservative world that Nora sketched up until 2000 was a book by Gombrich, who probably, if you're art historians, you've all read, called The Story of Art. And I think the word story is more and more interesting, and the word art is less and less interesting in that title. Because I think that what we are engaged in is a process of telling stories to each other and trying to work out what those stories might mean. And it's an ongoing process, and the stories are, of course, changing. It's a narrative, the writing of narrative that unites an exhibition, that makes an exhibition what it is in a certain sense. It's a narrative sometimes through three-dimensional objects, often also through literature. And it's a narrative that animates an individual artwork within that exhibition. But it's also narratives that animate institutions, and that give institutions legitimacy, that give institutions power, that give institutions the right to exist, fundamentally. It's often that institutions have their own situated and specific narratives, but at the same time they're part of much larger narratives of modern and contemporary art, of anthropology, of sociology, of ethnography, various disciplines which provide the basis on which it's possible to move. So I think there you see the relationship between theory and practice that we've been talking about. Actually, practice is impossible without theory, because you need the legitimation that theory gives you in order to practice. So when Nora is talking about these relationships between the two, theory and practice, we have to understand that it is, of course, a chicken and egg situation, but it's that theory fundamentally informs museums and museum practice. So it's not that these two things are either separated or powerless in relationship to each other. There is a dynamic between them. And I think what we've seen is that dynamic has both conservative, with the new public management that comes in the 80s, which you talked about, and potentially emancipatory. I mean, in the current situation, it feels very immodest to talk about emancipation, because we're moving in a direction away from emancipation at the moment, no? In most terms. But nevertheless, potentially, let's say there's a potential for emancipation within these institutions as well. And it is that potential which I think we have to cling on to, because otherwise we have a kind of totally pessimistic worldview. And of course, we can be pessimistic in our intellect, but we still need to have a certain optimism of the world in order to go forward, I think, or maybe not even directionally, but simply in order to survive and exist day by day. We need to see that those narratives can empower us. And I think we've seen through history that narratives can be empowering. It's not something which is a vague religious hope of the afterlife, but actually real narratives can be empowering. You know, class narratives were empowering of certain white people in Western and to some extent in Eastern Europe in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and allowed certain things to happen. They're not the narratives we need now, but the fact that those narratives existed means that there is a possibility. But it comes down to stories. I'm going to go over my 10 minutes, I realize now.
Take your time.
Yeah? Okay.
Take your time. Yeah.
I'll try to. So, if it's narratives that I'm talking about, what I'd like to do in the workshop, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what the workshop itself will be, and then try and do the exercise myself for Van Abbe, so that you sort of indicate how it might be. So, this is, I only have 5 slides, but they'll take a little while. The workshop itself, I hope, if you're willing to go with me on it, is that I would like you to tell a story in the way that I'm going to try and do in Van Abbe in a minute, about the institution that you're working within, the organization. Perhaps sometimes organization is better than institution. Tell us a story of the organization which you feel related to. Now, I don't mean an exhibition here. I really mean the housing body in which that exhibition or that project or that thinking or that development is taking place. It can be a university, it can be a museum, it can be Savvy Contemporary, it can be all sorts of different kinds of institutions. But what is it that institution, what's the narrative of that? And then I would ask us all within the workshop to listen to that narrative and to listen critically in that narrative and to think together and try and identify what is being erased. Now, I'm not saying it's your narrative. Yeah? It's not your narrative that you're telling. When I tell a Van Abbe narrative, it's an institutional, organizational narrative. Yeah, it's not my own individual identity, even having been there more than 15 years. There's a gap between institution and individual, and it's important to keep that. Otherwise, it becomes totalitarian, essentially, where you have no space beyond it. So this gap is important also for you to keep when you're telling this story, I think. So listen to that story of the institution as related by an individual, but of another thing, not the individual's opinions. And let's think together and try to identify what is being erased or extracted or silenced inside that narrative. And then ask questions of that institution embodied by this person without expecting answers. Yeah? I mean, I think there will be an attempt to make answers, but the questions are not there in order to produce answers. It's not the closure immediately of thinking through this idea that every question has to be immediately answered. Otherwise, it's an unsuccessful question. Yeah? Actually, the questions that are not immediately answered are the most useful ones. And then let's look in that conversation, or be attentive to where the questions actually provoke a moment of pause, yeah? A moment of stillness, a moment of, I'm not sure. Yeah? The ahs and the ers are kind of important in that. Because maybe that's what we need to return to later, these gaps between the confidence of the institutional narrative. Now I'm going to tell a little bit quickly the narrative of Van Abbe, if that's okay. Is there time to do that?
Yeah, please.
Okay, this will be a super quick Vogelflucht, you say in Dutch, a bird flight over the thing. So the Van Abbe Museum opens in 1936 as a modern art museum, and this is the building that's built in 1936 and was the building in 2003. So it's born. So this is a narrative that we've developed that I feel quite close to, but also I'm critical of in my own senses. It's born in 1936 as a private. It's called Van Abbe. It's a private institution originally. Becomes public in 1946. So 10 years later, after the Second World War. But it's private. It's essentially a late Enlightenment project. I hope that makes sense to you. It's colonially funded. He's a tobacco merchant making cigars. The tobacco comes from Indonesia, Sumatra, Delhi, in Medan. We're now working with those areas very specifically because that's, if you like, the foundation of the institution. But for a long time, this was kind of erased and hidden from the institution. And it's a patrician project. It's Mr. Van Abbe, the owner of the cigar factory, who donates part of the building and sells the collection in a sort of tax dodge mechanism in order to educate and enlighten and entertain the citizens of an industrial city, Eindhoven, which had and has more or less no state infrastructure. All the infrastructure in Eindhoven as a city has been developed from private initiatives. Mostly Philips, the Philips company, PSV in Philips, the football company, the pay is Philips. You know, this all goes back to private initiatives originally. After 1945, it adopts the US occupying Cold War definition of art and culture, which means the modernity or modernism, which comes from the Museum of Modern Art, autonomy, an exclusively Western narrative, and a sort of idea of second wave avant-garde. So the avant-garde that happened in the first half of the 20th century is collected, and the contemporary work that's collected at that time is a kind of, we could say, a depoliticized extension of that avant-garde of the first generation. Yeah, often second wave, if you like, has a different relationship to the core topics. It becomes a publicly funded museum for a modern public sphere, and modern I use in a very specific term or critical term or meaningful term. You know, the idea of modernism, modernity, all different terms, but nevertheless all relating to an ideology of progress, an ideology of growth, an ideology of social democracy to some extent, and neoliberalism on the other hand, both of which are encompassed by the modern, and an ideology of coloniality. Yeah? So an ideology which insists on white supremacy, which insists on the colonial as being the method in which the world needs to be ruled. And whether that's an economic colonialism or a direct military state colonialism doesn't much matter to the modern ideology. The coloniality is its core. And it's also developed in the context of a Western European idea of social democracy, which, of course, emerges as a defense mechanism to the communist discourse. Yeah? So it emerges, social democracy gains authority. If you like, social democracy is the child of Stalin, much more than it's the child of social democratic thinkers, as we understand it from the Cold War. It produced this reaction. That's why it collapses the moment the Soviet Union goes. The collapse happens at the same time. The collection that we have is a standard issue, non-contentious, I would say, in the sense that it comes with the authority of MoMA and the narratives which are injected into modernity. A standard issue, non-contentious 20th century European collection. The list a few of the things. And then in 2003, we get a new architecture, an idea of postmodern, which of course, in my understanding, is a totally absurdity in relationship to the idea of modern ideology, but postmodern in terms of style, a pile of white cubes upscaled and increased. This is the new building, 4 times the size of the old building. So this model of growth, which we talk about, which is at the core of modernist ideology, is very clearly represented here. 2003, so when you talk about it happening in the early 20th century, in Eindhoven it still was not quite, the critical aspects were still not quite available. Although this building took 30 years to build from its intention, so it kind of is generated to some extent in the 1980s. So my time as director, I would characterize in these terms, I think. And again, this is becoming then slightly more personal, but also something that because of the time that I've spent there, 15 years, I also feel quite distant, alienated, appalled, critical of the same process. So when I started in 2005, it was about, I think, broadening the geographies from Rudy Fuchs, who was a predecessor of mine, also curated a documentary in 1982, has a beautiful description at the beginning of Documenta 7 book, I think, where he describes traveling the whole world. And he describes the whole world as being from New York to Vienna. In Vienna, he smelled the East, but he didn't get any further than the olfactory sense. From New York to Vienna, from Stockholm to Naples. And that was the world. So that was the world that was inherited still more or less in 2005. It had extended to Los Angeles. That was the major step that had been made in the intervening 20 years. And so this broadening of geographies to the East and beyond, and to deconstructing the narrative of the collection, I think deconstruction was still, in that point, a kind of a topic. I mean, it doesn't sound particularly useful now, I think, but it's interesting that this deconstruction, in a sense, at least I feel looking back, was a deconstruction without a sense of what might replace the narrative that we were deconstructing. In other words, the deconstruction was itself, and I think possibly a necessary activity, but it was a very weak gesture, actually. It was picking up the sort of, beautiful Ming vase, if you like, as Ai Weiwei did once, and then smashing it, but then looking at the remnants and going, I don't know what we do now. And that was a little bit the problem of I think, the early period of deconstruction of these narratives. From 2008, we're faced with the global financial crisis, of course, and major financial cuts, and in a way, the collapse of that old social democratic consensus finally reached the shores of the museum. So it happens in 1990 or around that period, but actually takes 20 years, 18 years, to reach the real pragmatics of social democratic institutions, say in the Netherlands, as a result of the global financial crisis. And then the response from us, I think, was to get involved in identity politics, for better or worse, and to try and construct alter narratives, again, something that I wouldn't be happy with talking about now, through things like forms of resistance, tracing a passage from 1871 and the Paris Commune through to the contemporary moment with the Disobedience Archive, Arte Utile, Spirits of Internationalism, Confessions of the Imperfect. If you're interested in any of these, we can talk about them in the workshop. In 2015, we added, so it's quite late, it's only 7 years ago that really this idea of the decolonial became essential. So, we can be appalled by the fact that it took that long. But certainly this idea, for instance, of the museum being grounded in Indonesian workers on plantations, more or less under conditions of slavery in the 1930s, which is the money that produced the excess that made the museum possible, that's something that we don't really talk about in the museum until 2015. So 10 years after I arrived. So what was I doing? That would be a very legitimate question to ask in that intervening period. But in a sense, I'm dependent on that theoretical development and being aware of it, of course, that gives permission for those discussions to happen. And if we'd started them 10 years ago, even if I'd been aware of them, I think they would have been met with complete puzzlement, because it wasn't possible to have certain discussions without there being a narrative around it which can then speak to a wider public. So it's not about discovery or a sort of invention or originality or anything like that. It's about following. So this is following the decolonial imperative, I would say, and developing for ourselves a demodern imperative, which we can talk about, which is related specifically to a Western European condition, I think, where the demodern perhaps is more incisive in criticizing what we have than the decolonial, which can sometimes be postponed to the other, that the other needs to help the decolonizing, but demodernizing is something that touches on the core belief systems within the West, because the West is still defending itself as a modern state. So these were projects like that you see here, which again we can talk about. And then finally, I think in 2018, we started to think, or from 2018 started to think about being situated and constituent, which meant, I think, handing over the responsibility for the curation to communities that we could identify. And I think we're still in this process, but the most recent ones are delinking and relinking, and projects like the Living Room, again, the Museum as Parliament that we can talk about, which is about thinking about an embodied, so an actual public, rather than an abstract notion of public, which you talk to, an embodied public and a plurivocal approach, in other words, in which different voices are allowed. So I think that sketches out a little bit the histories of the museum, and then finally, then I will stop, what was forgotten, erased, or ignored from me. So these are the blind spots that I can see now. Yeah? So there are lots of blind spots that I can't see, but these are the blind spots that I see in that process of having been there for 15 years. I don't think, and we're trying to do now, that we really addressed governance and structure. I can explain in the workshop what the governance of the museum is. It's an interesting departure, deviant model from most, which have a board of governors consisting of particular kinds of socially privileged individuals. But nevertheless, we haven't really addressed it. So we inherited a governance structure, and essentially a lot of what we've done is decorating the outside, but not changing the inside. I think we've took far too less account of the kinds of elitism and leftist exclusions that are going on with trying to be radical and trying to be right. This is exclusions of different bodies, as you were talking about, exclusions of different capacities in the body, exclusions of different backgrounds, educational backgrounds, class backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, gender backgrounds. That all those things are often being excluded from a position of self-righteousness, which is a very easy position for the museum to adopt. Yeah? An idea that actually we have a narrative to tell, and this is the narrative that you have to listen to. So the constituent way of working, the embodied way of working, is trying to wind back the assumptions that we make in these kind of narratives. Connecting to place, it's interesting in a lot of projects that I've been doing more recently with other people, for instance in Indonesia, it's much easier for people there to talk about where they are and the traditions that come from than in Western Europe. In Western Europe, we constantly displace it. This is a colonial device, yeah? It's being colonial in this, and constantly displace it in terms of wanting to talk about South America, or wanting to talk about Africa, or wanting to talk about this, or wanting to talk about that, and never talk about Brabant, never talk about the farmers who live around the corner from us. Yeah, I was explaining that Reina Sofia has a project for opening their back door, which is to quite a poor community in the middle of Madrid. If we open our back door, there are cows, more or less. That's one of the most productive agricultural spots on earth surrounds us. It's an extraordinary place. Frightening place as well, to be honest, but a place which is completely removed from the discourse of the museum. We have no connection, and we're trying now to build it. And I think also what we underestimate always is and you mentioned it as well, actually, Ninhad, this idea of how the human relations, of what is possible in terms of capacity, what does it mean to take time, what does it mean to be productive according to management criteria, which are actually simply there in order to displace real thinking, I think, in many cases, yeah? to manage threats so that they become turned into productive outcomes. That process is something that I think we're really bad in doing. You know, I learnt my trade in the 1990s with people like Hans Ulrich Obrist and things where everything was about fluidity, speed, production, the capacity, flying all around the world. These whole processes, which I, in a small way participated in, I think are simply redundant now. Yeah, but I did participate in them, so there were blind spots in the past for me. So how do we take account of these things? That's it. Thank you very much.
I'm getting back with a common question to both of you. Could you specify the role of the object and of the collection and the archive? So I mean, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, immaterial, whatever is in your collection, so-called. Could you specify the fact that Savi is a non-public, it's very public, yeah, but it's not a public institution like the Van Abbe. Does this has an influence? And I mean, especially in the projects you were mentioning, the colonial neighbors, and also your neighbors, like the farmers. So maybe you could refer on that.
Okay, so basically, if I understand correctly, you want to know about the limitations, but also the chance of a space that is not fully publicly funded, and also about the role of an object in one of the archives. I don't understand the connection between the object and the non-for-profit. Okay.
No, it came to my mind that, I mean, you started with that you're luckily not in a museum, yeah, and you are in a museum, but you both work with collections in the broadest sense as the base for your narratives. And you also pointed out that that you're interested to work with your neighbors and with your closer surroundings.
Yeah, okay. So in general, just as I mentioned, we have an archive that's called Colonial Neighbors, but it's only one of many archives that we have. So we have, for example, also the Savi Doc, documentation center, which functions like a classical library and a space for engagement. But it's very vital in the way we work, because we say that the practice of citing is very important, to also say that we don't invent the wheel when we have a project or a series of exhibitions, that we always are influenced and activated by the writings of other people. And I think the very act of quoting, citing people is also summoning them, and it's also a form of collective work and acknowledgement of the people that accompany you in this journey. And another archive project is United Screens, where it's very film related. So we have a team that travels to India, Cairo, Tunisia, etc., and works with local filmmakers and self-initiated archives. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the project Padma as well, which is an archive format that's online, where people, especially in the so-called Arab Spring, were uploading their own footage. So we worked with the developers of Padma to also develop the Savi Doc archive, to think about forms of knowledge dissemination, the practice of engaging collective thinking. But Colonial Neighbors is very different because of the violent object. So we said it's very important to not have things that are violent just out there, not put them online, not have them always accessible in the space. Because, you know, we had different forms of showing these objects, and as you said, the limitations of not getting funding makes you also free. So you don't have to comply with the framework of, but you can just be very fluid in the way you work with things. So we had different forms of displaying the objects, and we had formats where we had an overhead and invited guests to sketch out a form of archive display that would work for them, how to interfere, because this is a very vital part of the archive. You need to interfere with this colonial past. You cannot just leave it out there without also thinking of tools of intervention in order to draft a new form of relational being towards these violent objects. So we also had mobile form structures where we invited people to also put things in a box and then turn the box to render things invisible that don't work for us. Yeah, there are different forms and formats in the different archives.
And the ownership, I'm asking because we always, from time to time we think about this goal of shared responsibility and shared ownership, which at the moment at public funded museums is not possible at the moment. Yeah, but did you think about that, or what is the long-term perspective for these objects? Do you return them? Do you keep them? Or?
So basically, the understanding when you donate, so all of these objects are donated because we say it's about the story behind the object. So it's not an accumulation of a theme of colonial objects. So we don't create these drawers like science fiction, contemporary art, colonial trinkets, and then you build this fetish about the narrative of the colonial objects. But it's more about how did your family acquire this object and how are you related to it. So it is material and immaterial. We work a lot with schools as well because we say one of these gaps that you also addressed are intentional, of course. And if we say in education, politics, society, there are intentional gaps in regards to accessing this very important part of history, then how can we work with these gaps? So we invite also classes to think about their relation to this part of history, and they're very conscious about, for example, the street naming, the renaming of street in the African Quarter, how you as a 12-year-old student walking home in the, let's say Moabit or Wedding, how you relate to these places. So again, there are material and immaterial objects that are brought to the table, songs, anecdotes, pictures, and the premise is you need to be open for this object to be destroyed, because we cannot offer you that we store it in a depot that is tempered, etc., etc. And a lot of times we have thinkers, makers, artists, activists to engage with the objects, and sometimes they just get destroyed in this, performance or in a different way of installing them. And I think several things, they don't need, not everything is meant to last. So I think we need to be open to the idea that things can just perish. We have, for example, the very first object was an album that was given to Bonaventure Sobeng Dikung, which had Cameroon written on it. And it's something like an album. Someone spent a year in Cameroon, was stationed, a German soldier. But clearly, as much as it's a very innocent language describing landscapes, fruit, people, you see places of violence, like Vermanfaktoreien, that played a vital role in securing forced labor that led to the first working camps, etc., and then concentration camps, etc., etc. So we say there's a narrative from there to here, and it's not about us now pointing the finger to the past and say, this was the period of the grand evil, but we are right now, we are silent bystanders in a whole game of denying other people's right of mobility as a collective. And in 200 years, people will point the fingers to us and say, how did they allow this? And so we try to bring this narrative and also situate ourselves within this.
Let's get some coffee and be back, please, in time in 15 minutes, 11:45. 20 minutes we have. Yeah? Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to announce our next guests, Matthias Beitel, Maria Alajova, and Andrea Gribenik. I would like to introduce also our colleague Luisa Zeyer. Luisa Zeyer, she is an art historian, she's a curator, a thinker, lecturer, author. She's since 2013 now in the Museum of Austrian Gallery Belvedere. She does amazing exhibitions there. She loves to work with the collection and also poses also questions that really focus on relationships between contemporary art and society, and also, let's say, historical politics or also actual politics. So also in the ECM, these questions, she's focusing a lot also about the history of and theories of exhibition or exhibiting, and especially, of course, on curating contemporary art. So yeah, Luisa, I hand over to you and your great guests.
I'm very happy that we share time and space today to think about questions that we are dealing with for a long time already, that we all share, that are quite complicated for us in theory and in practice, as we heard before. And I'm very happy to introduce the second panel, and maybe also a remark on the function of the panels. So the idea is to get an insight in the individual position, perspective on the question of our conference. So it's not so much about a debate that will take place here, but it will take place in the workshops in the afternoon, and of course also in our gathering in the late afternoon. So we will try to keep our time frame, so we will have a bit more than 1 hour for the next 3 panelists. And let me introduce the first, Andrea Gribenik. She will start, and maybe also one remark on the 3 following presentations or remarks or thoughts, perspectives on the question. I found when I was reflecting on your abstracts for the workshops, so one common denominator could be something like what Maria called in her abstract fictioning as a method. So we heard about narratives, complicating narratives, deconstructing and complicating narratives, but also maybe envisioning that things could be different is something that also drives us, because otherwise it would be a very pessimistic and depressing reality that we, of course, are facing, and this was addressed before. Of course, we should be aware of everything which is around us, how society develops, not in a good way, and also, of course, very actual political crisis happening. But on the other hand, we need to believe, I think, because this is why we do all this. We should believe in thinking things differently, and I think fictioning could be a method of this. Also believing in, changing structures, for example. So structures, organizational structures, will also be a topic of this panel. And now let me introduce Andrea Gribenik. Andrea is a curator, has worked in different institutions in the past, at GFZK in Leipzig and also at Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana, and she has been the director of the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, Koroška, since 2013. But in 2023, I think in January, you will start working in Graz at Kunsthaus Graz, so she has been just designated the upcoming director. She graduated in political science and international relations and obtained her PhD in the historical anthropology of art. And she has published a lot, curated many exhibitions, and what somehow drives her practice are the issues of the complex intertwinement of museums as historical and geopolitical spaces, where contemporary art questions and addresses present conflicts and struggles. So we are very much looking forward to your presentations, your thoughts, and the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. Thank you for this very extensive presentation. I feel quite intimidated now after this. So yes, I'm coming from an ex-socialist country. So I will talk about utopias today. I think it's something that actually we all have to, again, start thinking about, because there is notion within, as well as theory, as well as also practice, that we somehow have difficulties imagining something else or some other reality. I mean, there are many reasons that for. I mean, one of the main is probably like the all-encompassing global capitalism that we momentarily live in. So first, I will talk about dystopia, then to go to the utopia. And I don't know how many of you know the novel, not novel, but the book by Yevgeny Zamyatin. It's called We. It's a story about very dystopian society, like glass city structure. People are living there in very ordinary, like very ordered lives. It's, if you read Orwell, it's very much resembles the 84. But in a way, this society is built in a form of a panopticon. Like I chose this image just to give you an idea. Like it's a glass structure. People have everyday planned. There is no space for imagination or for passion or for something outside of it. And there is one thing that is within this glass city. It's an ancient house. An ancient house that is how they call it. And it was preserved by the government in order to show the superiority of the current, of this contemporary society. So this ancient house is kind of within a glass structure, but it's actually the only house without glass walls. And I will not go into the story of the protagonist because maybe it's something to read in summer for you. But what was interesting for me was this ancient house, because when the main protagonist first time enters this ancient house, he is confronted with chaos, with unknown objects, with something that is out of his imagination. So it's something that is completely different than he knows. And what is also symbolic is that, of course, this ancient house has a secret passage to the other side of the city where this protagonist meets and gets to know people who live outside this ordered society. So, and actually, of course, this society outside the walls, it's preparing a rebellion against the perfectly governed state and so on. So for me, this ancient house, it's a museum. It's actually a secret passage to another reality. And this is something that really inspires me to think about institutions. And I wanted to share this short sci-fi story with you at the beginning to actually give you an introduction into my lecture, which will be something about imagining different institutions and institutions in the future. But just to give you a brief context why I'm inspired by this story, it's also the place I come from. At the beginning, I said I come from an ex-socialist country, which is true. And actually, the museum, the Contemporary and Modern Art Museum that I work at, it's a really small museum, a regional public museum in the northern part of Slovenia, which was founded in the 50s. And in the 60s held international exhibitions with the idea that art can change the world. Of course, this idea was not so completely, I would say, new, and it was quite falling into the lines of the idea of Yugoslavia being different than East and West and showing another path in the world in congruence with a non-aligned movement, and so on. So this museum that I work at was actually built on this idea, art changing the world. And it was literally built by the local community, by actually also a lottery ticket, like lottery, by people who were contributing with their work and so on. So this story, it's quite, you see, already getting into this utopian. So they actually built in a small town of 5,000 people, they built a museum of 1,400 square meters for contemporary art. In the 66, this was for the first international exhibition. And these were really nice premises, and this is something that one can really hardly imagine today. For something like that to happen. And that's why I like to show this kind of images which show the museum. But of course, as Nora said at the beginning, it was something for me really to think, not to think about, but to emphasize it again, that as well as modernism is not without sin or is not innocent, also museums are not innocent, and also this museum where I work at is not innocent because it was highly politicized and it was marked by ideology. So it's actually marked on one hand by ideology and for me on the other on marked by idealism. So we have this constant negotiation between these kind of forces that are within the museum. And for example, it was used very often for political means, like being a place for kind of, I don't know, do other things, and art and institutions being in the background as something that is just a reason to be there. So for me it was a question, how can one work within such a museum and how can one deal with this very conflicted past and also with the conflicted present? Because we cannot kind of blind ourselves that like working in a public museum in Slovenia, it's of course marked by all this shift and global pressures and capital and interest and political interest also today. So this, what I was talking about the past, is as well true for today, but we just don't have such a distance to pinpoint it so clearly, but it is present. So actually, just few images from the contemporary exhibitions we did, and like to the topic of war, of course, we have a collection which I called Gallery for Peace, which was a collection established in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with donations of artists from all over the world, but of course containing also the traits of colonialism and imperialism and so on, which I will more thoroughly examine within the workshop, where I will focus on few points, like few stereotypes we have about museums and how within the curatorial practice we try to break them. And actually this is an image from one of the last exhibitions, Beyond Borders, because the museum is on the border, Austria, Slovenia, very conflicted relation in the past, yeah, just to give you an insight. I wanted to stop here and really to kind of say, but saying just a few words, because I think it's important that we are talking about an institution of a museum very objectively. I think that we have to be aware that the institution are people, and it's very important to be aware that it relies a lot on the directors of the institutions, how the institution is actually being positioned and how it's being run. In Slovenia, for example, in last year, a lot of changes happened because of the political pressure on the institutions. A lot of directors were, very capable directors were kind of removed or not removed, or they were replaced by other people who are more suitable. I mean, we probably, you know, the situation in Poland, where also Jaroslav Suchan, it's now not anymore. So it's something very dangerous happening. So for me, it's not enough to talk about only institutions and say responsibility of institution. I think it's the responsibility of us, all of us who are here, directors, curators, professional museum workers, to be aware of this, that there is a constant pressure and there is this constant negotiation happening in the field of museum, and it's a constant struggle for a museum that we want to imagine, and for a museum as a place of utopia for me. Thank you very much.
Let me please introduce Maria Hlabajova, who is an organizer, researcher, educator, curator, and founding general and artistic director of BAK, Basis für aktuelle Kunst in Utrecht. She has initiated so many research, publication projects that I cannot mention now, but maybe I will just mention the research, education, exhibition, and publication project Former West, Art and the Contemporary After 1989, and also projects that took place at BAK and beyond, Proposition for Non-Fascist Living that took place, that still takes place, that you started in 2017, Future Vocabularies, and I think vocabularies will be also a topic that we will come back to in a minute actually. So you published a lot, and your most recent publication is Toward the Not Yet, Art as Public Practice, and I think also that you will relate to this. This is why I mention it. You did it together with Jan van Heeswijk and Rachel Rakes. You are involved also internationally in different kind of capacities and networks, for example, Transit, which is also important for the Austrian context. This is why I mention it. And you also teach at the University now I missed the line. You teach in Bratislava, but also in the Netherlands. So I'm super happy that you're with us. And I hand over to you, Maria, and we will take your computer.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you. Thank you. How are you people? Doing well? So I'm going to try to DJ between or amongst various sets of notes. As I'm chronically known that I cannot do 10 minutes, but I'm going to try doing this, nonetheless. Am I audible well? I hear myself twice. It's quite confronting, I have to say. Anyway, happy birthday. I'm, of course, absolutely excited and honored to stand here before you. I'm going to speak indeed from within the practice of BAK, which is approximately as old as you are, although we've never been able to identify our birth dates because we're still instituting. Thank you for spending this morning with us, all of you, and including those of you who visited BAK in Utrecht. I recall wonderful gathering with ECM fellows in Utrecht, and also my students from Bratislava, whom here was we ending remarkable, heavy, and very empowering semester. I'm happy you're here. Now, the abstract of our gathering today begins quite with a forte, a succinct summary of where the field finds itself after many, many decades of intense conversations about institutions. The museum is dead, long live the museum. And of course, the adage in this or similar form could be applied to many other fields and aspects of life under the current conditions of the world. That is a concatenation of back-to-back crises and catastrophes. And as I speak on the day 70 plus of the war on Ukraine, again, I would like to remind us how close it came so that it reminds us of many other wars and catastrophes around the world. And we need to take this discussion on the museum, on the institution, precisely into this context. Of course, with this phrasal template, the king is dead, long live the king, I'm also reminded of Antonio Gramsci's definition of interregnum, right? So interregnum, a crisis that consists of the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born, a time-space filled with monsters, with morbid symptoms of the endless present. Of course, this adage then goes hand in hand with our wavering between utopianism of hope, and I refuse both utopianism and hope. I'll elaborate on this in the afternoon. So it makes us wavering between this utopianism of hope and negativism of despair. Yet neither of these two terms seems to offer a meaningful guidance through this terrifying time of interregnum. And as you see, what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is to kind of offer a couple of pointers for the afternoon, as all my colleagues are doing. But I'm going to try to do it with a kind of suggestion of a potential vocabulary, perhaps a lexicon, that will contain not just words, not just language, but some atmosphere, relations, images, and thoughts. So if neither hope nor despair do it, I want to offer another term that I think offers a more meaningful guidance through this terrifying time of interregnum. Despair. But despair replaced by disillusionment. That's the term, actually, I wanted to offer. Still need to orient in this. Disillusionment. And if it sounds slightly counterintuitive, I want to offer the notion of disillusionment in a positive sense, if you will. And I'm basing this in Rebecca Solnit's proposition, disillusionment as letting go of illusions. And I will be talking about the notion of the future, notion of utopia, notion of hope, as kind of staying in that realm of illusions. And I think we need to let go of illusions to figure out how to institute otherwise. I would like to, in that kind of set of pointers, bring this quote by Athina Athanasiou, which is relatively long, but I'm going to read it in full, because I think it's very important to understand why it is more important than ever to speak about institutions and practice institutions otherwise. Athina Athanasiou, the theoretical and political dilemma that arises is this. We need public spaces, homes, parks, public schools, public hospitals, public libraries, and public art institutions to sustain the possibility of living and being in common. And yet, at the same time, these very same institutions, with all their class, racial, ethnic, and gendered inflections, are technologies of normalization and disposability. As they determine and regulate the livability, they also compromise or negate the sustainability of certain modes of life. And they often do so while upholding the capitalist biopolitical genealogy of care, protection, and social security as socially ordained virtues historically associated with a privatized, middle-class, liberal morality. To phrase it differently, as much as instituted precarity saturates our lives under neoliberalism by rigidifying already existing inequalities and injustices and producing new ones, we cannot simply give up on the institutions that have been implicated in our suffering despite or precisely through their commitment to public interest. To put it bluntly, institutions sustain us and wipe us out at the same time. It's precisely this dilemma, this squeeze, which is an existential squeeze at this very moment, when it's very difficult to point out where else a livable life in common is a possibility. So I want to claim that this is the role of public institutions, including public institutions for arts, culture, and education. This, dear people, is our role. I want to negotiate this squeeze by instituting otherwise. I want to think instituting otherwise as a relational practice. And thus, if we had a semester together, I would start with debating the notion of radical publics, not the audience, the notion of radical publics, in order to understand how this notion of instituting otherwise is a collective practice of not merely institution making, but at the same time concurrently the practice of world making. Few pointers about the notion of instituting otherwise. I think to think through this concept, the fastest entry to it would be to turn to the notion of so-called instituent practices. Many of you may be familiar with it, introduced or conceptualized by philosopher and art theorist Gerald Raunig, who actually builds an argument of the institution of the common, not public institution, so there's a slight shift that one would need to negotiate. But Gribenik sees instituent practice as actualization of the future. That is, and I quote, not the opposite of institution, in the way that a utopia, for instance, is the opposite of bad reality. Instituent practice as a process and concatenation of instituent events is instead an absolute concept beyond the opposite of institution. It does not oppose the institution, but it does flee institutionalization. So this is the relational practice, which I see as embodied, situated, and relational practice as a proposition of another politics that institution can and must, in my opinion, engage with this. Such instituent practice does happen in the transversal overlaps between progressive art institution. I don't know a better word. Progressive is complicated and implicated in Western modernity, of course. But let's say a public art institution open to another relationality. Then radical artistic practices, again, for lack of better term, and other social actors, which I do refer in my practice, in my writing, in my teaching, and in the life of Bach to as the radical publics. So it's not your, perhaps to connect to what Charles was saying, it's not this abstract idea of the publics. This is a really embodied notion of publics, not an audience, but publics, that I think in order to perform an or operate or practice the institution meaningfully today needs to be present in this practice of instituting. A quick anecdote, again, not to go into theory, but to offer another entry into this. A friend not long ago asked me, why is there such a complicated, restless relationship between Bach publics and Bach itself? Isn't that, at the end of the day, that we are driven by same urgencies of social, ecological, political, economic, and other justices, culture justices, and the desire or yearning for a world of equity? Why such a restless relationship? Why such restlessness in our relation? He himself runs a relatively conventional musical ensemble that, although playing to full and a very, very satisfied audiences, and this is how he mused himself, does not posit any demands on the institution. And then he mused somehow revelatory, does not it mean that we no longer matter? Of course, I wanna get rid of this or that worldview, but it made me think. It made me think whether, in order to practice public art institutions meaningfully, not in this world, in spite of this world, whether one does not need radical publics that will keep the institution under pressure and to account. Now, this notion of keeping the institution under pressure and to account is not as simple as opposing the institution, as we know, through critique and other kind of direct anti-institutional relations. To keep institution or to hold the institution accountable is to pressure it to always necessarily start again, start anew. And this is this notion of instituent practice, is a kind of disturbance of artistic and intellectual enclosures that the institutions necessarily on a sort of automatic pilot end up kind of enacting, which actually means that this relationality of direct and anti-institutional position, or perhaps institutional critique, the way we know it in its banal sense, it actually traffics in artistic imagination only within that enclosure. So it's a trafficking between art or culture practitioners and the institution itself, which actually prohibits it to get out of, to get materialized, to get out of these particular enclosures. I think the positionality that this radical public stake towards the institution could be articulated again through this text by Athina Athanasiou that I already looked at, and I will only highlight this one thing, this notion of being with, within, and against institution concurrently. This positionality is something very different than being against, as kind of very banal interpretation of critique would actually suggest. But it's this ambivalent political positionality of being with, within, and against. The positionality that at the same time engages proximity and distance, engagement and disengagement. And through these instituent events, the institution gets deinstitutionalized and consequently reinstitutionalized into another modality. And thus this with, within, against positionality proposes a radical collective renegotiation of the subject positions of the audience, of viewer, visitor, spectator, participant, and even an ally, and constructing instead the relation through coalitionality, fellowship, co-conspiration, communion, mutual complicity, and even accompliship. This is not a spectacle of critique, but an opening up to a politics that simultaneously resists and enacts the institution through critical imagination as practice. And I'm really excited about bringing the fiction into this conversation, because my belief within this practice is that, of course, we need to engage theory and discourse in thinking how things are, but we cannot leave it there. We need to, from that thinking how things are, this kind of forensic analysis of where we are with the institutions, we need to, with the same breath, connect to imagining how things could be otherwise, and then live that imaginary as if it were possible. For me, that's the working of visionary fiction, which I differ quite radically from science fiction. I think science fiction asks the question, what will the world be? I believe visionary fiction asks, what do we, as problematic as the we is, want the world to be? And then the follow-up question is, how do we get there? So one needs to find another prospective temporality that is not the future, as Interregnum proposes, more and more catastrophes, more and more suffering. But it's a kind of way of deserting the linearity of chronopolitics of Western modernity and creating a space-time, if you will, where another thinking, collective thinking and exchange and imagining and doing is possible, even if temporarily. And I will refer to it as the notion of the not yet. And I need a zip of wood to go really fast through the rest, because I'm out of my time. Thank you. This is just entrance door to back, announcing, inviting people to this exhibition. I'll call it exhibition, Trainings for the Not Yet. It's a project that we've convened together, we at BAC, convened together with Dutch-based artist Jennifer Heeswijk, who envisioned Trainings for the Not Yet to be an exhibition as a series of trainings for the future, or for a future of being together otherwise. So I want us to hear what it really says. An exhibition as a series of trainings for a future of being together otherwise. I think this particular project, and I'm again hesitant about the use of the term project, I never found a better replacement, but when we talking about the shifting of the vocabulary, I would like to shift from the notion of the project, which is the beginning, middle, and the end, to the notion of commitment. And I think that notion of commitment is that kind of coming together of ideology and idealism that institutions must have, and that projects really flow from one into another, because because we need to figure out how to live a livable life in common, in spite of the world the way it is, not by running away from it, but moving toward it, but then otherwise. Now, 4 remaining minutes. If you wanted to visit this exhibition as a series of trainings, as an exhibition, you could, because you would encounter installed objects there, and many people did. Yeah, it depends on with which archive of knowledge you're entering artworks, how you're going to read them, and it's perfectly possible and legit to read this project through objects installed there. However, Jeanne van Heijswijk really insisted that she wants to see these objects as objects, but not art objects, but learning objects. Because all of these objects emerged from her previous engagement with various radical publics. And she sees them as archives of knowledge, archives of community learnings, if you will, which were there to train with. To train with in order to imagine and tactically really engage, affectively, conceptually, engage in a possibility of being together otherwise, to stay with the language of the exhibition. Now, I will, for our afternoon session, I will single out a number of learning objects, which, in my opinion, hugely importantly, unlike what language can really do, because language keeps me within the realm of Western modernity as I speak. There are vocabularies I'm still searching for, and I don't have them, but these learning objects really offer it, crucially. Because I would like to really envision a number of learning objects that actually start a scaffold for us, this idea of the not yet, this idea of an institution that we need to imagine and enact. I think this idea of enacting the imagination is of absolute crucial importance in order to understand, to start from the notion of interdependencies, not independencies, interdependencies, perhaps ultra-dependencies amongst one another, living, non-living, organic, non-organic, human, non-human, so that we articulate the notion of the not yet. That will be the second learning objects that we're going to go through in the workshop. Of course, Black Quantum Futurism that would offer us a way to understand another chronopolitics that goes away or kind of deserts or is fugitive in sense of abandoning the linear progressive line of capitalist utopia, if you will. Another object will be this notion of radicalizing the local. Radicalizing the local really addresses a concrete, one could say, post-capitalist or non-capitalist relationality of the Afrikaner Wijk collective in Rotterdam. That is really another way of relating to one another in order to establish economic, political, and affective conditions for a livable life in common. If this notion of radicalizing the local, as you also can see in the title of the project, really goes in depth, it really zooms at concrete radical possibilities of the local. There's one very important thing that I learned from Jeanne van Heijswijk, who told me that the notion of the local is not your zip code. It's not where the Google map points you at. It's a social struggle within which you are located. And we need to understand that these social struggles do have interconnections, much like you see in this image, to other places and other times around the world. And I think this offers a radical rethinking of this dichotomy of local versus global that kind of hijacked our imagination about the world over the last 30 years in the art field. And instead of local or global or glocal or whatever the terminology we were trying to find, with Jeanne van Heijswijk, we've been developing the notion of the situated practices. Situated practices that are situated in similar ideological and affective modalities all around the world, which offers completely different planetary or terrestrial picture if you think about it, if you imagine it. In this situation, we're going to start talking about exstituting otherwise rather than instituting otherwise. And of course, the notion of exstitution is around for quite a while, I think mid-1990s, Michel Serres. You may have come across this, but kind of addressing a centrifugal movements of the institutions in the process of their decentering. And developing exstitution that indeed, in the case of Bach, realizing that there are other locals that are driven by the same urgencies and that are interconnected with variety of histories, whether colonial history, history of gastarbeiters, etc., etc. So we've, within this institution, established research and artistic practice cells in Jakarta, in Istanbul, and online, being one of those locals. A last one, this notion of anticipatory learning. If you pushed me to answer in one sentence, what does such exstitution do? My answer would be, it engages with anticipatory learning practices. Now, anticipatory learning, I think, is something that at ECM is formulated in a similar way, I think, through a number of practitioners here. Anticipatory learning is collective coming together in order to learn what does not yet exist. And that's the practice of fictioning. It's thinking how things are, imagining how they could be otherwise, and together actually living that possibility. It's educational practice by disruption. Educational practice by disruption means it's an institution that can provide circumstances in which people come together with their own voices as themselves. It's like leaving the identities we force to perform outside of the institution in the real life, if that's the term that really helps us, to leave those identities outside of the institution, as much as all those urgencies that are being thrown at you, and entering the time space of the not yet as yourself, in the company of others, with your own voice. In order to learn together what does not yet exist, imagine what the world could be, and enacting it like that together in collectivity. I am aware this is temporary, that at some point from that kind of situation, condition of anticipatory learning with others, you step back into the real world. But there is something that stays with you, a residue in mind that can help practicing the possibility of another world in a daily life. And in that sense, and this is where I really end, and I connect to your presentation, we've been thinking of a shift from an art institution to community portal. Not a portal to another world. I wish we had a back door. But the time space that signals that the parameters of the world are possible to change, and that it's collective work of instituting otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. You brought so many aspects, strategies, thoughts on the table, and I think and hope that we will have the opportunity to really also think them through together. but having a look at the time, I'm jumping to Matthias and hope that we will have a quick round after your presentation on the panel. But I think we have many, many images, vocabularies, strategies already on the table. So please let me introduce Matthias Beitel. Matthias Beitel studied European ethnology and cultural studies at the University of Vienna, and he has been working in the museum and exhibition field for many, many years in different capacities. For example, at the Ethnographic Museum in Schloss Kitze, I think that was the first institution you were working at. You worked as a curator from 2003 at the Austrian Museum of Folk Life and Folk Art, from 2006 as deputy director, and since 2014 you have been the director of this institution. And I think it's quite remarkable how this institution has changed since you took over, because I think it's a very good example of what could be thought of instituting, commoning something like an institution of a Austrian Museum of Folk Life and Folk Art, which doesn't sound like that. But I think we will hear a little bit about your perspective on these questions. And you entitled your workshop "Never Arriving," which is also a really interesting approach of starting anew time and again. And I think we have many connections to what we heard before. And yeah, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Congratulations from my side. I mean, it's a huge public here. I was counting our years, actually. I think we are in contact for 15 years or more. So for me, it's a moment to think about age and and so on. But don't be depressed or whatever. All right, I had to bring one slide. It comes from my heart. I have to bring it up nearly all the time. Because what we are witnessing now is extremely tragic. It's a disaster, a nightmare, and a shock. And this person here, I follow this hashtag on Instagram. It's very interesting. Pop culture on war. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, actually. But this person here shattered the European dreams, as the Time cover in March was written there. But he destroyed my dreams. He disoriented me. He left me speechless, destroying countless human lives, infrastructures, developments, orders. And I'm so infinitely angry also at the fact that pure aggression and historical revisionism can transform us so immediately and so strong. You know, all the weapons, economy as a weapon, and so on. So in light of this autistic violence, I also have a creeping feeling that along our idealistic work, be it activist, digital, narrative, involving meta, political, and so on, we are kind of becoming romantics or whatever. So I'm really unsettled about our possibilities and our impact. And everything gets cracks for me somehow, and the questions also end up in the museum, like in our house, within an exhibition on Europe and our random We Ask wall in the permanent display. And I also see a development in Hungary, where mafia politics are meanwhile legitimized by a 2/3 majority because everything, including the narrative, is well prepared, controlled, and bought by a person and his system which aims for absolute power. And I ask myself, do we have something to say about it quickly enough as places of trust or safe spaces in public funding sphere? And how agile do we want to be, or can we be? What can our collections say about this, or should we do more program after all? And what does such a house even look like in answering these questions? And well, through the last years, we've done a lot of various experiments and topics with very different results, but it was a permanent work with a lot of people from outside the institution on topics and how we could communicate with the public, with our users. And so when I think about the relationship museum society, I always end up with the question of the underlying organizational forms and structures. I ask about the attitude of an institution and the associated individual freedom of its employees, as well about their mobilization and self-responsibility. On the one hand, the institution provides this security, it enables a livelihood and a life that can be planned somehow. But on the other hand, it is always a potential stopper, and it also becomes a fortress for thoughts and actions. So it kind of keeps it all together. In the last decade, there have been developed many idealistic and characteristics and concepts for museums. You know all these headlines: the liquid museum, the relational museum, the subjective museum, the radical democratic museum, so on. In a way, they all intend to contribute to a reflective, critical society. In my perception, we talk comparatively very rarely about the basic conditions of these institutions. I think that in some places and moments, one or the other will have succeeded, but the consciousness in cultural politics, in the big institutions and in the society, I mentioned it, let's say the users, is probably still missing for most part. Probably there are examples which I don't know, I haven't seen yet, but one should never give up to search for more. So I dream about everybody communicating by various possibilities and channels from every corner of the museum, from the collections to the facility management, because we have a responsibility in a meta-political sense. And this means that we should act as activists on the basis of an acquired attitude, with the task of pointing out political, social narratives and developments, analyzing them and putting them up for discussion. So therefore, this afternoon I would like to develop an organizational chart rather idealistically. So let's see if there is one or two good thoughts in it. And finally, the best thing is to always keep moving or to never arrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for relatively brief but to the point presentation, which gives us still time, like 10 minutes, but still. So we ended with this kind of with this question of structures, institutional, organizational structures. Before that, we had the ideological, ideal, illusionary aspect of museums. So it's quite a broad range of topics and levels where we could enter our small discussion, but maybe it would be also interesting to cross-connect your perspectives. I don't know.
Sorry, because I was very interested in listening, and I come from a very practical approach to, running this organization, and there's lots of change through the last 5 years, and what I learned is to keep up these synapses to the outside, and I think this is kind of the most important thing, to be, self-reflective and so on. So I think this is the tough work in the institution, and I wonder if you care for this in the institution, if it would be enough, if it itself would be institutionalized again. So where is the end somehow? So this is my question.
It's to both of us.
Yeah.
So I fully identify with this notion on which you ended. The notion of organization is key. How is this relationality I addressed organize is absolutely important. Because when I talk about radical publics, I talk about social organizing within the grassroots, and opening up an institution to a possibility of relating through this within against positionality. That essentially means that institution in this context is nothing else but a site of resources. Resources of time, space, care, relation, people, and money, of course, and lots of other things, right? So it's essentially joining the resources to the structure of organization, which is not providing access to whatever contents we offer, but through organizing together, through this relationality, actually building the content. The content is, of course, analyzing what the things are, imagining otherwise, and kind of enacting those. So also in the afternoon workshop, I'll go into this question of organizing, because one question is what the organization does, and I think it just needs to stop being in whatever canon writing, whether formal, official, or alternative. It's still canon writing. Just need to stop in this red race of who sees which hero artist first or shows. It needs to stop in spectacularization practices. It needs to, I believe, really engage in creating circumstances for collective aesthetic or political experimentation aided by fiction. But it comes down to this notion of organizing to a great extent. So I'm absolutely with you about this. The question then becomes, can institution become the world it advocates for? Because we all have these wonderful narratives, right? It's about what world we advocate for. My question is, are we that institution? Are we organized in that form? And hugely importantly, this third element would be a connection to the publics. Like, how do you patronize your relationality to the public? Yeah, so it's a balancing act from the position of power in the situation of sharing power. But I think all these three things, content, internal organization, and connection of the organization to the outside world, in this case the radical publics, is the question of organizing.
For example, for me, what is really interesting to, in the last years, think about is concept of the museum also as an institution of care. This has been addressed in last years quite a lot, and I think this connects, like you also mentioned, care, and this connects to all these levels that we spoke about within the institution, in terms of institution being an institution of care for people, for community, for objects also, for memory, for values. This is something that I really like to emphasize. But of course, here it's a question, and it's always a point of negotiation between this patronizing of what is the perception of the institution, if I say, in this way, and how can we make these walls of the institution more fluid in a way to connect to our audiences, to public, to radical public, as you say, which needs to be developed. It's not something that is given and that is there. It's something that the institution, together with the public, has to build. This is how I understand it. So for me, it's actually a question of deinstitutionalizing, which is also a word, like a key word, something that we often mention in the last years, of course, drawing from the deinstitutionalization movements of from the 70s on, like in the psychiatrical institutions, but it's also a question, how can we open up, deinstitutionalize institution, because it's something that we are really caught in our ways of thinking. And I really loved what Charles did today when he put up also the mistakes one does, which are many, also as a museum director, as a curator, and so on. We are all the time caught in our narratives, in our closed spaces, and it's very difficult to step out of it. For that reason, for me, it's important. I understand the notion of fictionalization, which is kind of a processual. But for me, to imagine this, one needs to think of fiction. So really to give yourself a thought experiment.
The idea of fictioning and living the fiction, actually, as if it were possible, is for me a crucial shift from critique to, or from resistance, if you will, to re-existence. It's a kind of temporary possibility to exist in the world we imagine together as the world we want. Knowing all well, and I keep stressing it, there's no back door to transpose ourselves, to catapult ourselves into that possibility. But it's a training, it's a rehearsal of another life. It's a possibility of a rehearsal of another life in the presence of others, or in connection through others. So this shift from resistance to re-existence is for me absolutely crucial. But you need fiction for it. You need fictioning as a method, which might sound very playful, but it's a matter of survival. So can you enter the institution together with others to temporarily, and knowingly temporarily, live a livable life in common? You know, it's really training, it's learning, it's anticipatory learning, knowing all well that is not possible yet to realize, but the institution can offer the not yet time space where such training can take place.
Okay, I will take up this notion of rehearsing. I think we have so many aspects, strategies, topics, vocabularies to take with us into the afternoon, and also to try to rehearse together. And I think the idea of the afternoon, the idea of this conference, is about thinking together with you, not just several people, a line of speakers monologizing in front of you, but doing it together, to think together about possibilities, strategies. So I'm very much looking forward to all your workshops. I'm looking forward to your thoughts and to create something that is more than catchphrases or bullet points that we exchanged or that we collected, but to make a small, slight difference, like in an afternoon. So I thank you so much for your insights, your very dense presentations, and of course, I thank you for your concentration, and I think I will hand over to Beatrice, who will introduce what will happen after the lunch break. Thank you so much.